Sometimes God puts the right person in the wrong place at exactly the right time. Sometimes the very mistake that seems like the end of everything becomes the beginning of the life you never dared to dream. Ezra Hawthorne, a 7-foot cowboy, known as the Giant, was hired to protect a rich man's daughter from trouble. He followed the trail to what he thought was the right cabin. But when the door opened, it wasn't the cattle baron's daughter standing there. It was Miriam Fletcher, a woman alone on 40 acres, waiting for a traveling preacher to bless her land before the bank took it away. She had lost her husband and he could never have children. The whole town had written her off. When she saw this giant of a man at her door, she thought he was the preacher she'd been praying for. Neither of them knew this simple mistake would change everything. But when Ezra's real job comes calling, will their chance at happiness survive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory stretched endless and unforgiving under the autumn sun of 1887, where men were measured not by their words, but by their ability to survive another winter. In the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, where the railroad had promised prosperity but delivered only half-empty saloons and broken dreams, folks had learned to recognize trouble by the sound of spurs on wooden planks. But when Ezra Hawthorne walked down Main Street, there was no sound at all, just the whispered prayers of shopkeepers and the sudden silence that falls when a legend passes through. At 7 feet tall, with shoulders that could block out the sun, Ezra moved with the careful grace of a man who had learned early that his size could be either a blessing or a curse. His weathered face, etched with lines that spoke of 35. Hard years carried the kind of quiet authority that made grown men step aside without being asked. They called him the Giant, though never to his face. In his saddlebags, wrapped carefully in oiled leather, lay a worn Bible that had belonged to his mother, a woman who had prayed every night that her oversized son would use his strength to protect rather than destroy. She had died when Ezra was 17, whispering her final words about how God had made him big for a purpose. The Bible had traveled with him ever since, though he rarely opened it anymore. Faith, like so many other tender things, had become a luxury he couldn't afford in his line of work. Ezra's reputation had spread across 3 territories. He was the man ranchers called when words failed and lesser men ran, not because he was quick with a gun, though he was fast enough when pressed, but because his mere presence could end a range war before the first shot was fired. When the Giant appeared on your property line, most disputes settled themselves. Smart men recognized that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially against a mountain of a man who could break a horse with his bare hands or carry a full-grown steer to safety during a flood. But the work was wearing on him. Each job meant another night alone under the stars, another town where he was feared more than welcomed, another reminder that his size made him a weapon first and a man second. He had saved lives and ended conflicts, but he had never saved himself from the loneliness that followed him like a shadow across the plains. The letter had arrived 3 days earlier, delivered by a nervous rider who wouldn't meet Ezra's eyes. The paper was expensive, cream-colored with gold edging, bearing the seal of Silas Drummond, the wealthiest cattle baron in the territory. The message was brief and to the point. His daughter Penelope was in danger from settlers who blamed the big ranchers for their troubles, and he needed the kind of protection that only the Giant could provide. The pay was generous, more than Ezra usually commanded, but something about the job felt different from the start. Drummond's instructions had been oddly specific. Follow the north trail from Cedar Ridge. Look for the cabin with the blue door and white fence posts. Protect the girl until the trouble passed. No questions, no complications, just do the job and collect the money. Silas Drummond himself was a legend of a different sort, a man who had built an empire from nothing but ambition and ruthlessness. He owned half the rangeland between the mountains and the railroad, controlled the largest cattle operation in 3 counties, and had a reputation for getting what he wanted, regardless of who stood in his way. His daughter Penelope was said to be as spoiled as she was beautiful, a city girl who had never worked a day in her life but expected the world to bend to her whims. The brewing land war was real enough. Homesteaders had been filing claims on open range that the big ranchers considered their own, leading to burned barns, poisoned wells, and the kind of escalating violence that left women widowed and children orphaned. Drummond claimed his daughter had received threats, warning her to convince her father to back down or face the consequences. It was the kind of situation Ezra had handled dozens of times before. Protect the innocent, let the lawyers and politicians sort out the rest. As Ezra rode north from Cedar Ridge, his horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust on the well-worn trail, he found himself thinking about his mother's Bible and the last conversation they'd had. She had spoken of a different kind of strength, the kind that built things up instead of tearing them down, that offered comfort instead of intimidation. He had been young then, still believing that good intentions were enough to change the world. The landscape around him told a different story. Abandoned homesteads dotted the valley, their broken windows and sagging roofs testament to dreams that had withered under the harsh reality of frontier life. The land was beautiful but unforgiving, offering prosperity to those strong enough to claim it and graves to those who weren't. It was a country that rewarded violence more often than virtue, where might made right, and the weak were swept aside like tumbleweeds in a storm. But as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ezra felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a strange sense of anticipation, as if he was riding toward something more significant than just another job. Perhaps it was the unusual nature of the assignment, or maybe it was simply the lonely man's hope that this time might be different. The trail wound through stands of aspen and pine, their leaves rustling in the cooling breeze that carried the scent of wood smoke and the distant promise of winter. Ezra had traveled this country before, but today it felt different, more alive somehow, as if the very land was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. He thought about Penelope Drummond, trying to imagine what kind of woman would inspire such protective concern from a father known for his cold calculation. Perhaps she was different from her reputation. Perhaps she was genuinely in danger. Or perhaps this was simply another rich man's paranoia, dressed up as parental duty. Either way, Ezra would do his job. He always did. The sun was low on the horizon when he finally spotted what he believed to be his destination, a small cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwoods with a blue door barely visible through the gathering. Dusk. White fence posts marked the boundaries of a modest property that looked well-maintained despite its humble appearance. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm yellow light glowed in the windows, creating a scene of domestic tranquility that seemed almost too perfect to be real. As Ezra approached, he could see that the cabin was smaller than he had expected, more like a homesteader's dwelling than the kind of place where a cattle baron's daughter might take refuge. But the details matched Drummond's instructions perfectly. Blue door, white fence posts, isolated location. This had to be the place. He dismounted slowly, his joints protesting after the long ride, and approached the front door with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned that first impressions could mean the difference between peace and violence. His hand moved instinctively to check his sidearm, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. The last thing he wanted was to frighten an already scared young woman. The evening air was still and quiet, broken only by the distant call of a meadowlark and the soft sound of his boots on the wooden porch. As he raised his hand to knock, Ezra found himself wondering what he would say to Penelope Drummond, how he would explain his presence without alarming her, and whether this assignment would prove as straightforward as it appeared. He knocked 3 times, firm, but not threatening, and waited. Footsteps approached from inside, light and quick, and he heard the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened slowly, cautiously, and Ezra found himself looking down into the face of a woman who was nothing like what he had expected. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, and eyes the color of autumn leaves. Her dress was plain but clean, the kind worn by women who worked with their hands and knew the value of every thread. Her face bore the kind of quiet strength that came from enduring hardship without losing hope, and when she looked up at him, this giant of a man standing on her doorstep, there was no fear in her expression, only a profound relief that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Brother Thomas," she whispered, her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and exhaustion that spoke of long nights spent in prayer. "I was beginning to think you weren't coming. Please." She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in." Ezra stood frozen on the threshold, his mind racing to process what had just happened. Brother Thomas. The woman before him was clearly not Penelope Drummond. There was nothing of the pampered cattle baron's daughter in her work-worn hands or the simple dignity of her bearing. Yet she had opened her door to him with such profound relief, such desperate hope, that he found himself unable to speak the words that would shatter whatever fragile expectation had brought that light to her eyes. "Please," she said again, stepping further back into the modest interior of the cabin. "I know you must be tired from your travels. I have stew on the stove and fresh bread cooling. You're later than I expected, but I suppose the Lord's timing is always perfect, isn't it?" The cabin's interior was clean and simple, furnished with handmade pieces that spoke of careful craftsmanship and hard-won self-sufficiency. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls decorated with a few simple pieces. A wooden cross above the mantel, a faded sampler bearing a Bible verse, and what looked like a wedding photograph on a small table beside the window. The whole space radiated the kind of warmth that came not from wealth, but from a woman's determination to make a home from whatever materials life provided. Ezra removed his hat, ducking slightly to avoid the low-hanging oil lamp, and found himself drawn into the domestic sanctuary despite his confusion. "Ma'am, Miriam," she corrected gently, moving toward the kitchen area where a pot of something savory filled the air with rich aromas. "Miriam Fletcher, I wrote to your mission society 3 months ago, explaining my situation. I wasn't sure my letter had reached you until I received word that a brother Thomas would be coming to help." She ladled stew into a blue ceramic bowl, her movements quick and efficient, and Ezra noticed the way she kept glancing at him, not with suspicion, but with the kind of desperate gratitude of someone who had been waiting for salvation so long that she was afraid it might disappear if she looked away. Around her neck, barely visible beneath her collar, he caught a glimpse of a thin gold chain that seemed to carry some small, precious weight. "Mrs. Fletcher," Ezra began carefully, his voice gentler than most people had ever heard it. "I believe. There may be some confusion. Oh, I know how I must look," she said quickly, setting the bowl on the rough wooden table and gesturing for him to sit. "A woman alone, trying to work land that's beyond her strength, probably seeming foolish for thinking God would send help for someone like me. But you're here now, and that's what matters. That's what gives me hope that maybe, just maybe, there's still time to save what William and I built here." William. The name hung in the air like a prayer, and Ezra saw her hand move unconsciously to that chain at her throat. The wedding photograph made sense now. This was a widow, alone and struggling, who had somehow mistaken him for a traveling preacher. The realization hit him like a physical blow, not because of the error itself, but because of the trust in her eyes, the faith that had led her to open her door to a 7-foot stranger without question. He should correct her immediately, explain who he really was and why he was there, But as she bustled about the small kitchen, her movements speaking of loneliness, temporarily held at bay by the presence of another human being, Ezra found the words sticking in his throat. When had anyone ever been glad to see him? When had? His arrival brought relief instead of fear. "Please sit," Miriam insisted, and there was something in her voice that made it impossible to refuse. "You must tell me about your journey, about the work you've been doing in other communities. I've been so isolated here. I sometimes feel like I'm the only soul left in the world." Ezra lowered himself carefully onto the wooden chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. The bowl of stew steamed before him, and he realized he hadn't eaten since dawn. More than that, he couldn't remember the last time someone had prepared a meal for him, had welcomed him into their home, not because they needed his services, but because they were simply glad for his company. "The work," he said slowly, choosing his words with the care of a man walking across thin ice. "It's been challenging. People are struggling, trying to hold on to what they've built." Miriam nodded, taking a seat across from him with her own small bowl. "That's exactly what I'm facing. The bank. They say I'm 3 months behind on the loan William took out to buy the seed and livestock. They've given me until the end of October to pay what's owed, or they'll foreclose." Her voice remained steady, but Ezra could see the fear beneath her composure. "I keep praying for a miracle, for some way to save our land. When I heard about traveling preachers who help communities in crisis, I thought perhaps—" She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. "I'm sorry. You probably think I'm foolish, expecting God to solve my problems when I should be working harder. To solve them myself? No," Ezra said, and meant it. "Not foolish at all." He took a spoonful of the stew, rich with vegetables and tender beef that must have come from her own small herd. "Tell me about this place, about what you and William built here." The question opened something in Miriam, and as the evening shadows lengthened outside the windows, she painted a picture of 2 young people in love, determined to carve out a life in the wilderness. They had started with nothing but hope and hard work, slowly building their herd, improving their modest property, dreaming of the family they would raise in this peaceful valley. "William was so sure we'd have children," she said softly, her hand moving again to that chain at her throat. "He carved a cradle before we'd even been married a year, said he wanted to be ready when the Lord blessed us. But the blessing never came. Month after month, year after year, nothing. The doctors in town said there was nothing wrong with either of us, that we should keep trying and praying. But after 5 years, she fell silent, and Ezra saw tears gathering in her eyes. He had witnessed many kinds of pain in his work, but this was different. The quiet anguish of dreams deferred until they withered into grief. William never blamed me, she continued. But I could see how it wore on him, watching our neighbors' families grow while our house stayed quiet. When the fever took him last winter, I think part of him was almost relieved to not have to pretend anymore that everything would work out. Ezra set down his spoon, his appetite disappearing in the face of her sorrow. "I'm sorry for your loss. People in town say I should sell out, move back east, where a woman alone might find work in a factory or as a seamstress. They mean well, but they don't understand. This land isn't just property to me. It's everything William and I dreamed together. It's all I have left of him. The wedding ring, that's what hung from the chain around her neck. She wore her husband's ring close to her heart, unable to let go of the past, but equally unable to move forward. The realization filled Ezra with an unexpected tenderness, a desire to protect this woman's fragile hope, even as he struggled with his own deception. "The bank," he said. "How much do you owe?" $300. The sum seemed to exhaust her just to speak. "It might as well be 3,000. I've sold everything I can spare, worked every day from dawn to dark, but the land barely produces enough to keep me fed. Without William's strength, without his knowledge, I'm failing at everything he worked so hard to build." $300. For Silas Drummond, it would be pocket money. For Ezra, it represented several months' pay. For this woman, it was the difference between hope and despair, between home and exile. "Mrs. Fletcher," he began, knowing he had to tell her the truth, but she held up a hand. "Miriam, please. And I know what you're thinking, that I'm a fool for holding on to this place, that I should accept reality and move on. But I can't help believing that God brought you here for a reason, that maybe, if you could bless this land, pray over it. The way traveling preachers do for communities in need. Maybe the harvest might be better than expected, or maybe—" She stopped, shaking her head at her own words. "Listen to me, expecting miracles from a stranger. William always said I had too much faith for my own good." As if summoned by her words, a gust of wind rattled the windows, and Miriam rose to add another log to the fire. In the flickering light, Ezra watched her move with the unconscious grace of someone accustomed to taking care of herself, and he found himself wondering what it would be like to have someone welcome him home each evening, to sit across from him at table, to believe in miracles enough for both of them. Outside, his horse nickered softly, reminding him of his true purpose. Somewhere in this valley, Penelope Drummond was supposedly waiting for his protection. But here in this warm cabin, watching this remarkable woman tend her fire and guard her hope, Ezra found himself reluctant to leave. One night, he told himself. He could stay one night, help her with some of the heavier chores, then continue to his real assignment in the morning. What harm could it do? Dawn came softly to the Fletcher homestead, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Ezra of his mother's quilts. He had slept fitfully in William's old chair by the fire, his large frame cramped, but his mind strangely at peace. The sounds of morning, Miriam moving quietly in the kitchen, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the gentle whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, created a symphony of domestic tranquility he had never experienced. When Miriam emerged from her small bedroom, already dressed for the day's work, she found him standing at the window, watching the sun creep across her struggling fields. "I hope the chair wasn't too uncomfortable," she said, her voice carrying the slight embarrassment of a hostess who couldn't offer better accommodations. "I've slept in worse places," Ezra replied, which was true enough. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Miriam." She smiled at his correction, and he noticed how it transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of worry that seemed to be her constant companions. "I was hoping you might stay for breakfast, and perhaps, if you have time, you could see the rest of the property. I know it's presumptuous to ask, but having someone else's eyes on the land, someone with experience in these matters—" Ezra found himself nodding before she finished speaking. Every rational thought told him to make his excuses, find the real Drummond property, and get on with his actual assignment. But watching Miriam Fletcher prepare breakfast with the efficient movements of someone who had learned to make much from little, he discovered that rational thoughts held less sway than they once had. After a simple meal of eggs from her small flock of chickens and bread that tasted better than anything he'd eaten in months, Miriam led him outside into the crisp morning air. The Fletcher homestead spread across 40 acres of valley floor, with the cabin nestled in a grove of cottonwoods near a clear-running creek. The land itself was good, rich soil, adequate water, natural windbreaks provided by stands of aspen and pine, but everywhere Ezra looked, he could see the evidence of a woman struggling alone against tasks meant for 2 pairs of hands. Fence posts leaned at dangerous angles, the small barn needed repairs to its roof, and the vegetable garden, though carefully tended, was smaller than it should be to support a working farm. What struck him most forcefully was not the decline, but how much Miriam had managed to accomplish on her own. "William always said this land could support 50 head of cattle," she explained, as they walked toward the pasture where a dozen animals grazed contentedly. "We started with just 3, a bull and 2 heifers, and built the herd slowly. After he died, I had to sell most of them to pay for his burial and the doctor's bills. These are all that's left." Ezra studied the cattle with the practiced eye of someone who had grown up around livestock. They were healthy animals, well cared for, despite their owners' struggles. They look good. Someone's been taking proper care of them. I do my best, but there's so much I don't know. William handled all the business dealings, the breeding decisions, the planning for market. I'm learning as I go, but learning isn't the same as knowing, is it? They walked to the barn, where Ezra immediately spotted problems that Miriam couldn't see or couldn't address alone. The main support beam was sagging, putting stress on the entire structure. Several boards were loose, and there were holes in the roof that would let in snow come winter. But there was also something else. Tucked away in the back corner, covered by an old blanket, was a shape that made Ezra's chest tighten with recognition. "What's under there?" he asked gently. Miriam followed his gaze and her face paled. Nothing important, just old things. But Ezra had seen enough cradles in his life to recognize one even when it was hidden. This must be the one William had carved in the early days of their marriage, when they still believed children would fill their home with laughter. The fact that Miriam kept it, but couldn't bear to look at it, spoke volumes about the depth of her loss. "Would you mind if I looked at your roof?" he asked, deliberately changing the subject. "I've done some carpentry work in my time." Relief flickered across her features. "Would you? I've been worried about it, but I don't have money to hire anyone, and the bank, well, they say there's no point in making repairs to property they'll soon own." Ezra found a ladder and climbed up to examine the damage more closely. The repairs needed were significant, but not impossible, for someone with the right skills and tools. More importantly, they were the kind of work that could be done in a day or two by a man with experience and strength to spare. "It's not as bad as it looks," he called down to her, "mostly just replacing some boards and patching the holes. The structure underneath is sound. I'm afraid I can't pay you for the work," Miriam said, her voice tight with embarrassment. "I know that's not why you're here, but I feel terrible asking for charity." "You're not asking," Ezra interrupted, climbing down from the ladder. "I'm offering. Sometimes that's how these things work. Someone needs help. Someone else has the ability to provide it. Maybe that's part of why I ended up at your door." The words surprised him, even as he spoke them. When had he started thinking in terms of providence rather than coincidence? But looking at Miriam's face, seeing the way hope dared to flicker in her eyes, he found he meant every word. They spent the rest of the morning walking the property, with Miriam pointing out William's improvements and sharing stories of their life together. Ezra found himself genuinely interested, not just in the land, but in the woman who had loved it enough to fight for it alone. Her knowledge was deeper than she gave herself credit for. She might not understand cattle breeding or market timing, but she knew every inch of her property, every seasonal change, every challenge the land presented. William used to say this. "Place had good bones," she told him, as they stood beside the creek that provided water for the livestock. He said that with enough work and patience it could be something special. "I used to think he meant profitable, but now I wonder if he meant something else. A place where people could build a real life, raise a family, be part of something lasting." Ezra knelt by the water's edge, cupping the clear liquid in his hands. It was clean and cold, fed by springs in the mountains that never ran dry. He was right about the bones. "This is good land, Miriam, the kind of place that could support a family for generations." "If there were going to be generations," she said quietly. "But God had other plans, I suppose." Standing up, Ezra found himself studying her profile as she gazed across the fields William had dreamed of filling with cattle. There was something in her bearing that reminded him of his mother, that particular strength that came from accepting disappointment without abandoning hope entirely. It was a quality he had always admired, but never possessed himself. Maybe God's plans aren't finished yet, he heard himself say. Miriam turned to look at him, and for a moment something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that they were both people who had been knocked down by life, but had somehow found the courage to keep standing. It was a fragile moment, tentative as a deer approaching water, but it was real. "I should check on the cattle," she said finally, though neither of them moved. "And I should get started on that roof," Ezra replied, though he made no move toward the barn. Instead, they stood by the creek for a few more minutes, listening to the water flow over smooth stones and watching clouds drift across the wide Montana sky. For the first time in years, Ezra felt no urgent need to be anywhere else, to complete any mission other than the simple task of helping a good woman save her home. It was a dangerous feeling, he knew, but as autumn sunlight warmed his face and Miriam Fletcher smiled at something she saw in the distant pasture, danger seemed like a small price to pay for a taste of the peace that had always eluded him. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Ezra worked on the barn roof, his shirt soaked with sweat, but his movements steady and sure. Below him, Miriam tended to tasks that had been waiting for stronger hands, mending fence posts, hauling water, mucking out stalls that had been cleaned too quickly in recent months. Every so often, one of them would glance toward the other, and if their eyes met, they would share the kind of smile that spoke of shared purpose and growing comfort. It had been 3 days since Ezra's arrival, 3 days in which the deception had deepened with every passing hour. He still hadn't found the courage to tell Miriam who he really was, partly because the lie had become so complex that untangling it seemed impossible, but mostly because he couldn't bear to see the light fade from her eyes when she learned the truth. She had begun to bloom in his presence. Her step was lighter, her laughter came more easily, and she had started talking about the future as if it held possibilities rather than just obligations. "You're different from what I expected in a preacher," she had said that morning over breakfast, her tone curious rather than suspicious. "More worldly, I suppose. You know about cattle and carpentry. You handle tools like a man who's worked with his hands his whole life." Ezra had nearly choked on his coffee. The mission field requires practical skills, he'd managed, hating himself for the ease with which the lies came now. "Not much point in saving souls if you can't help people fix their roofs." She had laughed. At that, a sound that had followed him up onto the barn roof and stayed with him through the morning's work. When had anyone's laughter ever affected him so profoundly? When had he ever cared so much about maintaining someone's happiness? By late afternoon, he had finished patching the worst of the roof damage and climbed down to find Miriam standing in the doorway of the cabin, holding something in her hands. As he approached, he could see it was a photograph, faded and creased with handling. "This was William," she said simply, holding out the image. "I thought you might like to see him, to know something about the man who built this place." Ezra took the photograph carefully, studying the face of the man who had won Miriam's heart. William Fletcher had been slight of build but strong-looking, with kind eyes and the weathered hands of someone who worked the land. He stood beside a younger Miriam in front of the cabin, both of them squinting into the sun but smiling with the confidence of people who believed their love could overcome any obstacle. He was a good man, Ezra said, and meant it. Anyone who could inspire such devotion from a woman like Miriam had to possess qualities worth admiring. He was, Miriam agreed, taking back the photograph and gazing at it with the mixture of love and loss that seemed to color all her memories. "Sometimes I feel guilty for enjoying your company so much, as if I'm being disloyal to his memory." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Ezra felt his chest tighten, recognizing the significance of what she had just admitted. She was telling him, in her careful way, that she felt something growing between them, something that went beyond gratitude for his help with the farm. "I don't think your husband would want you to spend the rest of your life alone," he said carefully. "A man who loved you as much as he clearly did would want you to find happiness again." Miriam nodded, though tears gathered in her eyes. "I know. You're right. It's just letting go feels like losing him all over again." Without thinking, Ezra reached out and touched her shoulder, a gesture meant to comfort, but which sent an unexpected jolt of electricity through both of them. For a moment, they stood frozen, acutely aware of the physical connection between them and the emotional territory they were beginning to explore. "I should start dinner," Miriam said softly, but she didn't move away from his touch. "Let me help," Ezra replied. Though he had never offered to help with kitchen work in his life, they moved into the cabin together, working side by side to prepare the evening meal. The domestic intimacy of the task, Miriam teaching him how to knead dough for biscuits while she seasoned a pot of beans, felt more profound than any of the dramatic moments that had defined his previous life. Here, in this simple kitchen, sharing quiet conversation and gentle laughter, he found a kind of contentment he had never known existed. "Tell me about your calling," Miriam said as they sat down to eat. "What made you decide to become a preacher?" The question caught Ezra off guard, and he found himself struggling for words that wouldn't be complete fabrications. "I suppose I've always felt drawn to helping people," he said slowly, "though I haven't always known the best way to do it." "That's honest," Miriam replied. "I appreciate that. Sometimes I think the most faithful thing we can do is admit when we don't have all the answers." After dinner, they sat on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Miriam had brought out a shawl against the evening chill, and Ezra found himself noticing details he had missed before. The way she tucked her feet up under her skirt, the grace with which she moved her hands when she talked, the way her voice grew, softer when she spoke of things that mattered to her. "Brother Thomas," she began, then caught herself. "I'm sorry. May I ask your given name? It seems formal to keep calling you by your title when you've been so kind to me." Ezra felt panic rise in his throat. He couldn't give her his real name. Ezra Hawthorne was too well known in this territory, and even if she didn't recognize it immediately, someone else might. But he also couldn't bear to deepen the deception with yet another lie. "Thomas," he said finally. "Thomas is my given name." It wasn't entirely untrue. Thomas had been his middle name given to him in honor of his grandfather. It felt like a small mercy, this thread of honesty in the web of falsehoods. "Thomas," she repeated as if tasting the sound of it. "It suits you, strong but gentle." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of the farm, cattle settling for the night, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. It was the kind of peace Ezra had never believed possible, the kind of moment he would have dismissed as sentimental foolishness just a week ago. "Thomas," Miriam said quietly, "would you pray with me for the harvest, for the future of this place? I know it's presumptuous to ask, but having someone to share the burden of prayer," the request hit him like a physical blow. She wanted him to pray, to speak to the God his mother had believed in but whom Ezra had lost touch with, somewhere along the trail of violence and loneliness that had defined his adult life. How could he pretend to commune with the divine when he felt so cut off from anything resembling grace? But looking at Miriam's face, seeing the trust and hope there, he found himself nodding. Of course. They knelt together on the porch, and Miriam bowed her head, waiting for him to lead them in prayer. Ezra closed his eyes, feeling more fraudulent than he had ever felt in his life, and tried to remember the words his mother had taught him so. "Many years ago, Lord," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "we come before you with grateful hearts for this land, for this home, for the chance to be of service to one another." The words came slowly, painfully, but they came. "We ask for your blessing on this harvest, for your protection over this place and over Miriam, who has shown such faith and courage." As he spoke, something unexpected happened. The words, which had started as mere performance, began to feel real. The gratitude he expressed for Miriam's presence in his life, the plea for her protection and happiness, these came from someplace deep inside him that he had thought long dead. "Amen," Miriam whispered when he finished, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with tears. "Amen," he echoed, and for the first time in 20 years he meant it. A week had passed since that evening prayer on the porch, and the rhythm of life at the Fletcher homestead had settled into something that felt dangerously close to permanence. Each morning, Ezra would wake before dawn to tend the cattle while Miriam prepared breakfast, and each evening they would sit together planning the next day's work as if they had been partners for years rather than strangers thrown together by mistake. The transformation in both of them was remarkable. Miriam had gained weight. Her face had lost its hollow, worried look, and she moved with the confidence of someone who no longer faced every challenge alone. The farm itself was thriving under Ezra's attention. Fences were straight and strong. The barn was weatherproof, and the vegetable garden had been expanded to produce enough surplus for winter storage. But it was Ezra's transformation that would have shocked anyone who knew his reputation. The man who had once settled disputes with his imposing presence now spent his days learning the patient arts of farming. His gun belt hung unused on a nail in the barn, gathering dust while he focused on tools of creation rather than destruction. For the first time in his adult life, he went to sleep each night with dirt under his fingernails from honest work, and woke each morning with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with intimidation or violence. On this particular morning, he made a decision that surprised even himself. After breakfast, instead of heading out to the fields, he saddled his horse and rode into Cedar Ridge. It was time to face the consequences of his choices, to formally withdraw from the assignment that had brought him to this valley in the first place. The town was bustling with its usual mix of ranchers, homesteaders, and merchants, but Ezra noticed how conversations stopped when he passed, how people stepped aside to give him room. His reputation as the giant preceded him everywhere, a shadow he had never been able to escape. But today, for the first time, he found himself wanting to be known for something other than his capacity for violence. He stopped first at the bank, where the manager, a nervous little man named Whitmore, nearly dropped his papers when Ezra ducked through the doorway. "Mr. Hawthorne," Whitmore stammered, "this is unexpected. Are you here on business?" "Mrs. Fletcher's loan," Ezra said without preamble. "What would it take to make it current?" Whitmore's eyebrows shot up. "Mrs. Fletcher, the widow with the failing farm? I'm afraid that account is well past due. We're proceeding with foreclosure proceedings. How much?" Ezra repeated, his voice carrying just enough edge to remind the banker who he was dealing with. $340, Whitmore said quickly, plus fees and interest. "But Mr. Hawthorne, even if the account were brought current, the woman has no means of maintaining payments going forward. It would simply delay the inevitable." "That's not your concern," Ezra interrupted. He reached into his vest and withdrew a leather pouch that contained most of his savings, money earned through years of dangerous work that had paid well, but cost him dearly in other ways. "Will this cover it?" Whitmore's eyes widened as he counted. "The bills? Yes, more than cover it. But I must ask, what is your interest in this matter?" Ezra met the man's gaze steadily. "Mrs. Fletcher is under my protection now. See that she's treated accordingly." The banker nodded rapidly, making notes in his ledger with hands that shook slightly. In the space of 5 minutes, Ezra had accomplished what Miriam had been praying for since her husband's death. Her farm was safe, at least for now. Next, he rode to the post office, where he composed a difficult letter to Silas Drummond. The words came slowly, each sentence a step further away from the life he had known. "Mr. Drummond, due to circumstances beyond my control, I will be unable to complete the assignment we discussed. I am returning your advance payment and recommend you seek alternative protection for your daughter. Respectfully, E. Hawthorne." He sealed the letter with the advance money Drummond had given him and handed it to the postmaster. There was no going back now. He had officially abandoned his reputation, his livelihood, and quite possibly his safety. Drummond was not a man who took kindly to being defied, especially by hired help who thought they could simply walk away from their obligations. But as he rode back toward the Fletcher homestead, watching the sun climb toward its zenith over land that was beginning to feel like home, Ezra found he had no regrets about the choice he had made. For the first time in his life, he was choosing love over fear, hope over cynicism, and the possibility of peace over the certainty of violence. He arrived back at the cabin to find Miriam in the kitchen, preparing lunch and humming softly to herself. The sight of her, flour in her dark hair, sleeves rolled up from kneading bread, moving with the unconscious grace of someone completely comfortable in her own space, filled him with such tenderness that it took his breath away. "You were gone longer than usual," she said, looking up with a smile that made his heart skip. "I was beginning to worry." "I had some business in town," he replied, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Miriam, there's something I need to tell you." She must have heard something in his tone, because she stopped her work and turned to face him fully, her expression growing serious. "What is it?" Ezra took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the rest of his life. He had to tell her everything, who he really was, why he had come to her door, what he had done that morning to secure her farm. The truth would hurt her, might even drive her away, but he could no longer build their future on a foundation of lies. "The bank loan," he began. "It's been paid. Your farm is safe." Miriam's hand flew to her throat, her eyes widening in shock. "Paid? But how? I don't understand." "I paid it," Ezra said simply. "This morning in town, $340 plus fees." For a moment, Miriam just stared at him, her mind clearly struggling to process what he had said. Then tears began to flow down her cheeks, and she sank into the nearest chair as if her legs could no longer support her. You saved my farm," she whispered. "But why? How could a traveling preacher have that kind of money?" This was his moment, his chance to tell her everything. But before he could speak, Miriam rose from her chair and crossed the room to stand in front of him. Without warning, she reached up and placed her hands on either side of his face, her touch gentle but sure. "I don't care," she said quietly. "Whatever brought you here, whoever you really are, I don't care. You've given me back my life, my hope, my future. You've shown me kindness when I had given up expecting it. You've made me remember what it feels like to be—" She didn't finish the sentence with words. Instead, she rose up on her toes and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of all the gratitude and growing love she couldn't express any other way. Ezra had been kissed before, but never like this. Never by someone who knew his gentleness as well as his strength. Never by someone who had seen him work with his hands to build rather than destroy. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. "Miriam," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. "Stay," she whispered back. "Whatever happens, whoever comes looking for enters, just stay." And in that moment, standing in the kitchen of the woman he loved, Ezra Hawthorne made a promise that would change everything. For 3 more days, they lived in the golden bubble of their newfound love, working side by side during the daylight hours and sharing quiet evenings on the porch as autumn painted the valley in brilliant shades of red and gold. Ezra had never known such contentment existed, had never imagined that happiness could be found in something as simple as watching Miriam tend her chickens or listening to her hum while she worked in the garden. But beneath the surface peace, both of them carried the weight of unspoken truths. Ezra knew he still owed her the full story of who he was and why he had come to her door, while Miriam wrestled with feelings that seemed to betray her late husband's memory, even as they filled her heart with hope she had thought lost forever. On the 4th morning after their kiss, as they sat sharing breakfast and planning the day's work, Miriam reached into her apron pocket and withdrew the letter that had arrived the day before, the final foreclosure notice that was now meaningless. "Thanks to Ezra's intervention at the bank. I've been carrying this around since yesterday," she said, unfolding the official document. I keep reading it and remembering what it felt like to think I was going to lose everything William and I built. And then I think about how you saved it all, and She stopped, shaking her head. Thomas, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Ezra's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. Of course. Who are you really? The question was asked gently, without accusation, but it cut through him like a blade. I've been thinking about it for days now. A traveling preacher with that much money in his pocket? A man of God who knows more about cattle and carpentry than scripture? Someone who moves like he's used to danger, who watches the horizon like he's expecting trouble. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside, her movements deliberate and controlled. I'm not angry, Thomas. I want you to know that. Whatever brought you to my door, I'm grateful for it. But if we're going to build something together, and I hope we are, then it needs to be built on truth. Ezra set down his cup and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a yoke. She deserved honesty, had earned it through her kindness and courage and the love she had offered him without conditions. But the truth was so far from the gentle preacher she believed him to be, that he feared it might shatter the fragile paradise they had built together. My name isn't Thomas, he began, his voice rough with emotion. It's Ezra Hawthorne, and I'm not a preacher. Miriam's face went very still, but she didn't look away. Tell me. I was hired to come to this valley by a man named Silas Drummond. He's a cattle baron who owns most of the rangeland between here and the railroad. He told me his daughter was in danger from settlers who blamed big ranchers for their troubles, and he needed someone to protect her. The words came slowly, painfully, each one a step further away from the man Miriam had believed him to be. I followed his directions to what I thought was his property, a cabin with a blue door and white fence posts. But those directions led me here, to you. When you opened that door and mistook me for the preacher you were expecting, I should have corrected you immediately. But he stopped, struggling to find words that could explain the inexplicable. But you looked at me like I was an answer to prayer instead of a problem to be solved. You welcomed me into your home, shared your food, told me about your dreams and fears. No one had ever done that before, Miriam. No one had ever been glad to see me coming. Miriam's hand moved to the chain around her neck, her fingers finding her husband's wedding ring through the fabric of her dress. The gesture spoke of distress, of a woman trying to anchor herself in the face of revelation that changed everything she thought she knew. What kind of work do you do, Ezra? She asked quietly. What kind of man does Silas Drummond hire? When he needs protection? This was the hardest part, the truth that might drive her away forever. They call me the giant, he said. I settle disputes that can't be settled with words. I'm the man ranchers hire when they need someone who can end trouble before it starts, just by showing up. You're a gunfighter. It wasn't a question. Not exactly. I've never hired out my gun, never killed for money, but I've used my size, my reputation, the fear I inspire in other men. Yes, I've made my living being the kind of man people cross the street to avoid. Miriam closed her eyes, and Ezra watched the woman he loved grapple with the knowledge that the gentle man who had saved her farm, who had prayed with her and kissed her with such tenderness, was also someone whose very name was whispered in. Saloons across 3 territories. The money, she said finally, the money you used to pay off my loan was earned honestly, if not gently. Years of taking jobs that paid well because they were dangerous, because most men wouldn't risk taking them. I never stole, never cheated, never hurt anyone who didn't deserve hurting, but I can't pretend I was anything close to the man you needed me to be. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of broken illusions and the fear that love might not be enough to bridge the gap between who they had believed themselves to be and who they really were. Are you still working for Drummond? Miriam asked. No. I sent him a letter 3 days ago, returning his money and withdrawing from the job. Whatever he hired me to do, whoever he really wanted me to protect, it doesn't matter anymore. Did he say, Only person I want to protect is you." Miriam opened her eyes and looked at him directly, and Ezra saw something in her expression that he couldn't quite identify. Not anger, not fear, but something more complex. Disappointment mixed with understanding, hurt tempered by compassion. "You lied to me," she said simply. "Yes. You let me believe you were a man of God when you're, what did you call it? A man people cross the street to avoid." Yes. Each admission was like a nail in the coffin of his happiness, but he owed her the truth, no matter what it cost him. Miriam stood up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the land they had worked together, the farm he had helped her save. When she spoke again, her voice was so quiet he had to strain to hear her. "I need time to think, Ezra. I need you to leave for a while. Not permanently, just, I can't think clearly with you here." The words hit him like physical blows, but he had expected them, had hoped against hope that her love might be strong enough to overcome the deception, but had known in his heart that asking her to accept such a fundamental lie was probably asking too much. "I understand," he said, rising from his chair. "I'll pack my things. The work you did here, the money you spent, it was real, wasn't it? Your feelings for me, more real than anything else in my life," he said fiercely. "Whatever else was a lie, Miriam, that was the truest thing I've ever known." She nodded without turning around. "Then maybe there's hope for us yet. But I need time." Ezra gathered his few belongings, saddled his horse, and prepared to leave the only place that had ever felt like home. As he mounted up, Miriam finally turned from the window, and he saw tears streaming down her face. "Where will you go?" she asked. "Not far," he promised. "I'll be close enough to come if you need me, far enough away to let you breathe." He rode away from the Fletcher homestead with his heart breaking, carrying the taste of happiness on his lips and the fear that he had lost the only woman he would ever love. Ezra had made camp in a grove of aspens 1/2 mile from the Fletcher homestead, close enough to watch for trouble, but far enough to honor Miriam's request for space. For 2 days he had lived on jerky and creek water, his eyes rarely straying. From the distant cabin, where the woman he loved wrestled with the knowledge of who he really was, he slept fitfully, starting at every sound, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun he had strapped back on when he left the safety of domestic life behind. On the 3rd morning, as golden sunlight filtered through the changing leaves and painted the valley in shades of amber and rust, Ezra heard the sound that had haunted his nightmares, horses approaching at a gallop, too many of them, and moving too fast for any innocent purpose. He scrambled up the nearest tree, his size making the climb awkward, but his urgency lending him speed, and peered through the branches toward the main trail. What he saw made his blood run cold. 8 riders in dark coats, led by a man whose expensive clothes and bearing marked him as someone accustomed to command. Even at this distance, Ezra recognized the silver-handled walking stick and the cold arrogance in the way the man sat his horse. Silas Drummond had come calling, and he had brought an army. The riders reined up in front of Miriam's cabin, their horses snorting and pawing the ground as if sensing their riders' hostile intentions. Drummond dismounted with the careful movements of a man who had grown soft behind a desk, but still carried himself like someone who expected immediate obedience. His men remained mounted, hands resting casually on their weapons, professional gunmen who had been hired for more than their ability to ride horses. Ezra was too far away to hear the conversation, but he could see Miriam emerge from the cabin, her posture straight and unafraid, despite being outnumbered 8-1. She spoke with Drummond for several minutes, gesturing toward the property as if explaining something, while the cattle baron's expression grew darker with each passing moment. Then Drummond said something that made Miriam step back, her hand, flying to her throat in the gesture Ezra had learned, meant she was frightened or upset. The rancher pulled a folded paper from his coat, some kind of official document, and thrust it toward her. Even from his distant perch, Ezra could see her shake her head firmly, pointing toward the cabin, as if indicating that whatever Drummond wanted, it was not hers to give. That's when Drummond's voice rose loud enough for Ezra to catch fragments of words carried on the morning breeze. "Told you before, Mrs. Fletcher, and not a request, and most chilling of all, one way or another." Miriam backed toward her cabin door, clearly trying to end the conversation, but two of Drummond's men had dismounted and moved to flank her. She was trapped between them and their employer, a small woman facing down forces that could destroy everything she had fought to preserve. Ezra scrambled down from the tree, his mind racing through possibilities. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but he knew this land better than Drummond's hired guns, and he had the element of surprise. More importantly, he had something they didn't, a reason to fight that went beyond money or orders. These men were threatening Miriam, and that made them his enemies regardless of whatever business dispute had brought them here. But as he checked his weapons and prepared to ride to Miriam's defense, something Drummond said stopped him cold. "Giant you hired to clear her out," followed by "failed to complete the job." The words hit Ezra like physical blows. Clear her out, failed to complete the job. The horrible truth began to crystallize in his mind, piece by terrible piece. There had been no daughter in danger, no settlers making threats, no protection job at all. Drummond had hired him to remove Miriam Fletcher from her land, and the mistake that had brought him to her door had been no mistake at all. Moving closer while staying hidden in the underbrush, Ezra could now hear the conversation clearly, and what he heard made his stomach turn with revulsion and rage. "Water rights are worth 10 times what that pathetic farm produces," Drummond was saying. "I've been patient, Mrs. Fletcher, more patient than you deserve. The bank foreclosure should have ended this months ago, but someone mysteriously paid off your loan before we could complete the transfer." "I don't understand," Miriam replied, her voice steady despite the obvious threat surrounding her. "This is my land, bought legally and paid for with my husband's blood and sweat. If you want water rights, there are proper channels." "Proper channels!" Drummond's laugh was harsh and cold. "You think this is about proper channels? This is about business, Mrs. Fletcher. Big business that doesn't have time for the sentimental attachments of small-minded homesteaders." He gestured to one of his men, who produced what looked like a surveyor's map. "Your property sits on top of the largest underground spring system in this valley. Without access to that water, my cattle operation and half the ranches in this territory will be worthless within 5 years. The railroad is coming, bringing new settlements, new demands for water that will drain the surface sources dry." Ezra watched in growing horror as Drummond spread the map on the ground, pointing to areas that clearly showed the Fletcher homestead sitting directly over an underground river that fed springs throughout the region. It was a source of wealth beyond imagination, and Miriam had been sitting on top of it without knowing its true value. "Your husband knew," Drummond continued, his voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow made his words more menacing. "William Fletcher was smarter than you've given him credit for. He found geological surveys, water table maps, had the whole system charted before he died. That's why he insisted on this particular plot of land, why he was so determined to hold on to it, despite the obvious challenges of farming in this location." Miriam's face had gone pale. "William never said anything about water rights. He just said this land had good bones." "Good bones," Drummond snorted. "Mrs. Fletcher, your good bones are sitting on water rights worth at least $50,000, maybe more, depending on how the railroad development proceeds. Did you really think I was going to let that slip through my fingers because of one stubborn widow's attachment to a few acres of barely productive farmland? The map, that had to be the deed hidden somewhere in the cabin, the one Miriam probably didn't even know existed. William Fletcher had protected his wife by not telling her the true value of their land, but he had also left her vulnerable by not preparing her for the forces that would inevitably try to take it away. "I hired Ezra Hawthorne to convince you to leave," Drummond said, rolling up the map with satisfaction. "The giant has a reputation for being very persuasive when it comes to encouraging people to make the right decisions. But it seems Mr. Hawthorne has developed some unfortunate personal attachments that have interfered with his professional judgment. One of the gunmen leaned down from his saddle. Boss, we could still make this easy. The woman's alone, no witnesses. Accidents happen all the time on homesteads. No! Drummond's voice was sharp. I'm not a murderer, regardless of what you might think. But I am a businessman, and I will have those water rights one way or another. He turned back to Miriam, his expression almost sympathetic. I'm prepared to offer you $500 for your land, Mrs. Fletcher. It's more than fair compensation for property that was never worth fighting for in the first place. Take the money, relocate somewhere more suitable for a woman alone, and this all ends peacefully. And if I refuse? Miriam asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Then we'll find other ways to encourage your cooperation. Perhaps the barn burns down in an unfortunate accident. Perhaps your cattle wander off in the night. Perhaps you discover that living alone on isolated property isn't as safe as you thought. Drummond's smile was cold as winter. I prefer not to resort to such methods. But I will have that land, Mrs. Fletcher. The only question is whether you leave with compensation and dignity, or whether you leave with nothing at all. Ezra had heard enough. Everything he thought he knew about his assignment had been a lie. Drummond had never needed protection for his daughter. He had needed someone to terrorize Miriam into abandoning her home so he could steal the water rights that Miriam Fletcher had died protecting. The mistake that had brought Ezra to the wrong cabin had saved Miriam from the very fate she was facing now, and it had given both of them a chance at happiness that was about to be destroyed by the truth of what Drummond had originally intended. But as Ezra prepared to reveal himself and face down the men who threatened the woman he loved, Miriam did something that stopped him cold. She straightened to her full height, looked Silas Drummond directly in the eye, and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had found her strength in the crucible of loss and loneliness. "Mr. Drummond," she said clearly, "you can go to hell." And that's when Ezra knew that whatever happened next, he had chosen the right woman to love. The sound of Miriam's defiant words seemed to hang in the morning air like smoke from a fired gun. For a moment, even Drummond's hired men looked surprised. They had clearly expected the lone woman to crumble under pressure, not stand her ground with the fierce dignity of someone who had already lost everything that could be taken from her, except her self-respect. Drummond's face darkened, his mask of civilized negotiation slipping to reveal the ruthless predator. Beneath, "Mrs. Fletcher, I don't think you fully understand the gravity of your situation. You are one woman, alone, with no family to protect you and no neighbors close enough to hear you scream. I'm offering you a way out that allows you to keep both your dignity and your life. I suggest you reconsider." But before Miriam could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk, deep, calm, and carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The lady said, "No, Drummond. I believe that ends the negotiation." Every head turned toward the sound, and there stood Ezra Hawthorne in all his imposing glory, having emerged from the tree line, like an avenging angel. At 7 feet tall, with his weathered face set in lines of controlled fury and his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun, he looked every inch the legend that had made his reputation. The morning sunlight seemed to gather around him, casting his shadow long across the ground between him and Drummond's men. "Ah, the famous giant," Drummond said, though Ezra could hear the slight tremor in the man's voice. "I was wondering when you would make an appearance. Come to collect the rest of your payment, perhaps?" "I came to collect something," Ezra replied, stepping forward with deliberate slowness. "But it's not your money." He could see the confusion in Miriam's face as she looked between him and Drummond, trying to piece together the implications of their exchange. The hurt in her eyes when she realized that these men knew each other cut him more deeply than any physical wound ever had. "Mrs. Fletcher," Ezra said without taking his eyes off Drummond, "I need you to go into the house and find your husband's Bible. Look for any papers he might have hidden in it. Maps, deeds, anything that looks official. "Ezra, what's happening here?" Miriam's voice was strained with the effort of trying to understand forces that seemed to be swirling around her without her comprehension. "Your husband was protecting you," Ezra explained, still watching Drummond's men for any sign of movement. "He knew what this land was worth, knew that men like Drummond would come for it eventually. He hid the proof where he thought it would be safe." Drummond laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Even if she finds whatever Miriam Fletcher left behind, it doesn't matter. Legal documents can be lost, destroyed, forgotten. Water rights can be transferred through any number of channels, especially when the current owner is no longer able to object." The threat was clear, and Ezra felt the familiar cold focus that had kept him alive through years of dangerous work. But this time, the stakes were different. This wasn't about money or reputation or even survival. This was about protecting the woman who had shown him what it meant to be loved, not for what he could do, but for who he could be. "Miriam," he said softly, "please do as I asked. And while you're in there, I need you to load your husband's rifle." She hesitated for a moment, her gaze moving between Ezra and the 8 armed men who surrounded her property. Then, with the kind of courage that had allowed her to survive alone on the frontier for over a year, she nodded and disappeared into the cabin. 8 against 1, Hawthorne," Drummond observed. "Even someone with your reputation might find those odds challenging." "Depends on what we're fighting for," Ezra replied. "Your men are here for money. I'm here for something that matters more." As if summoned by his words, riders appeared on the horizon. Not Drummond's men, but neighbors Ezra, recognized from his trips to town. Sam Morrison, who owned the spread to the north, the Kellerman brothers, who ran cattle on the eastern border of the valley, old Pete Kowalski, whose family had been homesteading in these parts since before the railroad surveys began. "Seems like Mrs. Fletcher has more friends than you thought," Ezra said, as the riders approached. Drummond's expression grew even darker. "How?" "Word travels fast in small communities," Sam Morrison called out, as he and the others reined up behind Ezra. "Especially when someone like Silas Drummond rides through with hired guns, asking questions about water rights and making threats." Pete Kowalski spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "We've all heard the rumors about what you've been doing to homesteaders who won't sell out, Drummond. Figured it was time someone stood up to your bullying." The odds had shifted dramatically. Suddenly, Drummond's 8 hired guns were facing a dozen determined men who knew the country, knew each other, and most importantly, knew what they were fighting for. These weren't professional gunfighters motivated by wages, but fathers and husbands and neighbors who understood that what happened to Miriam Fletcher today could happen to any of them tomorrow. From inside the cabin came the sound of furniture being moved, drawers being opened, and then Miriam's voice, sharp with excitement. "I found it, Ezra, I found it!" She emerged from the cabin carrying an old Bible and a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been hidden for years. Her face was flushed with discovery and something that looked almost like vindication. "William did know," she said, holding up the document. "He knew about the water, about what it was worth, and he made sure it was all legal, all documented." She looked at Drummond with newfound confidence. "This deed specifically mentions mineral and water rights, Mr. Drummond. My husband wasn't just a dreamer, he was protecting our future." Drummond's face had gone pale as he realized that his careful plan to steal valuable water rights was crumbling before his eyes. Legal documentation meant lawyers, court battles, and publicity he couldn't afford. More importantly, it meant that the simple intimidation tactics that had worked on other homesteaders would be useless against a woman who now knew exactly what she owned and what it was worth. "This doesn't change anything," Drummond said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Legal documents can be challenged, disputed in court for years. Do you have the money for that kind of fight, Mrs. Fletcher? Do any of you?" "She won't be fighting alone," Sam Morrison said firmly. "What affects one of us affects all of us. We'll pool our resources, hire the best lawyers we can find, and make sure this gets settled the right way." But Ezra could see that Drummond wasn't finished. Men like him didn't give up easily, especially when the stakes were this high. The cattle baron was calculating odds, weighing options, looking for any advantage that might let him salvage his plans. And there was something in his expression that suggested he still had cards left to play. "Mr. Hawthorne," Drummond said slowly, his voice taking on a deceptively reasonable tone, "I think we need to discuss the terms of your original employment. You were hired to complete a specific task, and you've failed to do so. In fact, you've actively worked against my interests. That's not the kind of behavior I expect from someone with your reputation." Ezra felt the familiar weight of his past settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Everyone present, the neighbors who had come to help, Miriam with her newfound hope, even Drummond's hired guns, was watching him, waiting to see how the giant would respond to being called out by his former employer. "I quit," Ezra said simply. "The job, the reputation, all of it, I'm done." "I'm afraid it's not that simple," Drummond replied, his smile returning. "You see, walking away from Silas Drummond isn't something a man does lightly. It tends to follow him, to complicate his life in unexpected ways. Ask around. There are men who thought they could simply withdraw from their obligations to me. None of them found it to be the simple matter they expected." The threat was clear, and Ezra realized that even if they won today's confrontation, Drummond would never stop. He would use lawyers, hired guns, political connections, and any other weapon at his disposal to destroy anyone who stood in his way. Miriam's water rights made her a target that would never fade, and loving her made Ezra a target as well. But as he stood there in the morning sunlight, surrounded by good men who were willing to fight for what was right, watching the woman he loved hold the deed that proved her husband's foresight and her own right to the land she had defended so courageously, Ezra felt something he had never experienced before. He felt like he was exactly where he belonged. "Drummond," he said, his voice carrying across the homestead with perfect clarity, "if you want that water, you're going to have to go through all of us to get it. And I promise you, that's not going to be as easy as you think." In the distance, a church bell began to ring. Brother Thomas, the real preacher, calling the community to Sunday service. But as the clear, strong sound echoed across the valley, it seemed less like a call to worship and more like a rallying cry, summoning all good people to stand together against the forces that would tear apart the lives they had built with their own hands. The battle for Miriam Fletcher's future and Ezra Hawthorne's soul was about to begin. The church bell continued to ring across the valley, its clear bronze voice carrying Brother Thomas's call to worship. But the sound had taken on a different meaning in the tense standoff at the Fletcher homestead. To the homesteaders who had rallied around Miriam, it seemed like a call to righteousness, a reminder that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the cost. To Drummond's hired guns, it might as well have been a funeral bell, marking the end of what should have been a simple intimidation job. Drummond himself stood in the center of the conflicting forces, like a man caught between hammer and anvil. His expensive clothes and silver-handled walking stick marked him as someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. But the growing crowd of determined homesteaders and the towering presence of Ezra Hawthorne had clearly disrupted his carefully laid plans. "This is your last chance, Mrs. Fletcher," Drummond said, his voice carrying the strained patience of a man whose authority was being openly challenged. $500, and you can walk away from this with your dignity intact. Continue down this path, and I guarantee you'll regret it." Miriam stepped forward, still clutching her husband's Bible, and the deed that proved her ownership of the most valuable water rights in the territory. The rifle Ezra had asked her to load was visible through the cabin's open door, leaning against the wall, where she could reach it quickly if needed. "Mr. Drummond," she said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment, "this land means more to me than money ever could. My husband died working this soil, believing in its promise. I've spent the last year learning to survive on my own, learning to be strong enough to honor his memory. You think $500 or $5,000 could make me abandon all? Of that, she looked around at the faces of her neighbors, men who had left their own work to stand with her against forces that threatened them all. Besides, I'm not alone anymore. I have friends, people who understand that what you do to one of us, you do to all of us. Sam Morrison nodded grimly. She's right, Drummond. We've all heard what happened to the Hendersons when they wouldn't sell out. Their barn burned down 3 days after they refused your offer. Could have been an accident, could have been something else. And the Kowalski place, added Pete's younger brother. Cattle scattered, fences cut, well poisoned. Funny how all these accidents happen to people who won't take your money. Drummond's facade of civilized negotiation was slipping away, revealing the cold calculation beneath. Accidents happen on the frontier, gentlemen. It's a dangerous place for people who aren't careful about the choices they make. But his hired guns were shifting restlessly in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with the way the situation was developing. They had been hired for what should have been a simple job: intimidate one isolated woman into abandoning her property. Instead, they found themselves facing a dozen armed men who knew the country and had every reason to fight to the death to protect their homes and families. Ezra could read the tension in their body language, the way their hands moved closer to their weapons, the nervous glances they exchanged as they realized that easy money had turned into a potential bloodbath. He had worked with men like these before, knew how they thought, and what motivated them. Most importantly, he knew that hired guns fought differently than men defending their homes. They were dangerous but not desperate, skilled but not committed to death. "Drummond," Ezra said, his voice cutting through the rising tension like a blade. "Call off your dogs and ride away. This doesn't have to end in violence." "I'm afraid it's too late for that, Hawthorne," Drummond replied, his mask finally falling. "Away completely. You've made this personal by interfering with my business, and Mrs. Fletcher has made it expensive by refusing a generous offer. Some lessons can only be taught with blood." He stepped back toward his horse, a movement that served as a signal to his men. The lead gunman, a scarred veteran with dead eyes and steady hands, started to draw his weapon. Not fast, not with the flashy speed of a show-off, but with the deliberate precision of a professional killer who had done this many times before. But Ezra was faster. The sound of his Colt clearing leather was like thunder in the morning air, and before the hired gun could complete his draw, he found himself looking down the barrel of the giant's weapon. The other gunman froze, suddenly aware that the legendary reputation they had heard about was built on very real skills. "I said call them off," Ezra repeated, his voice deadly calm. For a moment the tableau held, hired guns with their hands hovering over their weapons, homesteaders with rifles and shotguns at the ready, Miriam standing defiantly beside her cabin door, and Ezra Hawthorne facing down 8 professional killers with the kind of cold confidence that had made him a legend across 3 territories. Then the church bell stopped ringing, and in the sudden silence, everyone could hear the sound of more horses approaching from the direction of town. Brother Thomas was coming, leading what looked like half the congregation of Cedar Ridge, drawn by reports of trouble at the Fletcher place. "Seems like your odds keep getting worse, Drummond," Sam Morrison observed with grim satisfaction. But Drummond's smile was cold as winter wind. "On the contrary, gentlemen, I think they just got much better." And that's when the shooting started. The first shot came not from Drummond's hired guns, but from one of his men positioned behind the barn, a sniper who had circled around during the tense negotiations. The bullet whined past Ezra's head, close enough to burn, and suddenly the morning air erupted in a symphony of gunfire that shattered the pastoral quiet of the Fletcher homestead. Ezra dove toward Miriam, tackling her to the ground behind the cabin's front porch, just as splinters exploded from the wooden posts where she had been standing. "Stay down!" he shouted over the chaos, but even as the words left his mouth, he saw her crawling toward the cabin door where her husband's rifle waited. The homesteaders had scattered for cover with the practiced efficiency of men who had survived frontier violence before. Sam Morrison found shelter behind the well, his rifle barking steadily at targets among Drummond's scattered men. The Kellerman brothers had taken position behind their horses, using the animals as mobile cover while they returned fire. Old Pete, Kowalski, had somehow made it to the barn's far side, where he could enfilade any of Drummond's men who tried to use the building for cover. But it was Miriam who surprised everyone. Instead of cowering inside the cabin as everyone expected, she emerged with William's rifle, planted herself behind the wooden cross that marked her husband's grave in the small cemetery beside the house, and began firing with deadly accuracy at any of Drummond's men who showed themselves. "Miriam, get back!" Ezra called, but she shook her head fiercely. "This is my land," she shouted back, working the rifle's lever action with smooth efficiency. "My husband died for it, and I'll be damned if I'll let these bastards take it without a fight!" The wooden cross splintered under return fire, but Miriam held her ground, using the sacred symbol as both shield and statement. This was more than a battle for water rights. It was a fight for the very soul of what the frontier represented. The right of ordinary people to build lives and defend them against those who would take everything through force and intimidation. Ezra found himself grinning despite the bullets whistling around them. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, not the broken widow he had first met, but the fierce defender of her home, who had been hiding beneath the surface all along. She was magnificent in her fury, terrible in her righteousness, and absolutely deadly with her late husband's rifle, but the battle was far from one-sided. Drummond's hired guns were professionals, and they quickly adapted to the chaotic situation. 2 of them had taken cover behind the horse trough, laying down covering fire, while others maneuvered for better positions. The sniper behind the barn continued to pick targets, forcing the homesteaders to keep their heads down at crucial moments. "Hawthorne!" Drummond's voice cut through the gunfire from where he had taken shelter behind his expensive buggy. "End this now, and I'll let you and the woman walk away. Keep fighting, and I'll make sure neither of you leaves this place alive." Ezra's response was to put a bullet through the buggy's wheel, sending Drummond scrambling for better cover. "The lady already gave you her answer," he called back. The tide of battle seemed to shift moment by moment. Just when it appeared the homesteaders were gaining the upper hand, Drummond's men would regroup and launch a coordinated assault that forced everyone back to defensive positions. The sniper remained a constant threat, his elevated position behind the barn, giving him clear shots at anyone who exposed themselves for more than a few seconds. Then Brother Thomas arrived with the church congregation, and everything changed. The real traveling preacher came over the hill, leading 20 men and women from Cedar Ridge, all armed and all furious at the attack on one of their community's most vulnerable members. But instead of charging into the firefight, Brother Thomas did something that caught everyone by surprise. He began to ring a large brass bell that he had brought from the church, the same bell whose sound had been calling the community together. All morning, the clear, strong sound cut through the gunfire like a sword through silk, and something almost mystical happened. The homesteaders rallied to the sound, their fire becoming more coordinated and effective. Meanwhile, Drummond's hired guns seemed to lose their nerve, unnerved by the way the bell seemed to mock their violence and announce their crimes to the entire valley. "That's enough!" Brother Thomas's voice boomed across the battlefield with all the authority of righteous anger. "Silas Drummond, you and your hired killers are committing murder on holy ground. Look around you. You're shooting at decent people, defending their homes, firing on women and men of faith who only want to live in peace." For a moment, even the gunfire slackened as everyone, attackers and defenders alike, was caught by the power of the preacher's words. In that brief lull, Miriam stood up from behind the splintered cross, her rifle still in her hands, but pointed skyward. "Mr. Drummond," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the scarred homestead, "you came here to steal what my husband died protecting. You brought guns and threats and hired killers to terrorize a woman you thought was alone and helpless. But you made one mistake. You underestimated what people will do when they're fighting for everything that matters to them. She gestured to the men and women who had rallied to defend her land, their faces grim with determination, despite the danger they faced. These people didn't come here for money or because they were ordered to. They came because they believe in something you'll never understand, that some things are worth more than profit, that some fights are worth the cost. Drummond rose from behind his damaged buggy, his expensive clothes torn and dirty, his face twisted with rage and frustration. "This isn't over, Fletcher. Legal or not, documented or not, I will have that water." But his words lacked conviction. Now, and his men were already looking for ways to withdraw from a battle that had turned against them. The combination of determined resistance, community solidarity, and Brother Thomas's moral authority had broken the back of their assault. "Yes, it is over," Ezra said, stepping out from cover with his gun trained on Drummond. "You lost the moment you decided to steal from good people instead of earning what you wanted honestly." And in the distance, the church bell continued to ring, calling all good people to stand together against the darkness. 3 months later, the Fletcher homestead bore little resemblance to the struggling farm that had welcomed a lost giant on that fateful autumn evening. Where once there had been sagging fence posts and a leaking barn roof, now everything spoke of prosperity and hope. The vegetable garden had been expanded threefold, the cattle herd had grown to nearly 30 head, and smoke rose cheerfully from the cabin's chimney in the crisp December air. But the greatest change was not in the land itself, but in the two people who worked it together with the easy rhythm of partners who had found their perfect match. Ezra and Miriam moved through their morning chores with the kind of synchronized efficiency that spoke of deep understanding and shared purpose. Their conversations peppered with the gentle teasing and comfortable silences of two people who had discovered that happiness could be built from the simplest materials. The legal battle over the water rights had been resolved more quickly than anyone had expected. Drummond's attempted theft had been exposed in territorial court. His hired guns had fled the territory after giving evidence against him, and his own business empire had crumbled under the weight of investigations into his other illegal activities. The water rights were confirmed as belonging to Miriam Fletcher, and the underground spring system that William had so carefully documented was now being developed in partnership with the neighboring homesteads, ensuring prosperity for the entire community rather than just one greedy cattle baron. Brother Thomas had become a regular visitor to the homestead, not as the preacher Miriam had originally mistaken Ezra for, but as a friend who had stood with them in their darkest hour. On this particular morning, he was scheduled to perform a ceremony that would finally make official what everyone in the valley already knew, that Ezra Hawthorne and Miriam Fletcher belonged together. "Are you nervous?" Miriam asked as they finished the morning milking and headed back toward the cabin where she would change into her wedding dress. Ezra considered the question seriously, as he did most things these days. The man who had once made decisions based on instinct and necessity now had the luxury of reflection, of considering his words and actions in the light of their effect on the woman he loved and the community they had helped to build. "Not about marrying you," he said finally, "but I keep thinking about how different things might have been if I'd found the right cabin that first night." Miriam smiled, the expression lighting up her face in a way that never failed to make Ezra's chest tighten with gratitude. "But you did find the right cabin, Thomas. You just didn't know it at the time." She had taken to calling him by his middle name, the one thread of truth he had given her during those early days of deception. And somehow it had become more real to him than the reputation he had carried for so many years. Ezra Hawthorne, the giant, was fading into legend. Thomas Fletcher, for he would take her name as she had once taken William's, was the man he had chosen to become. As they approached the cabin, They could see guests beginning to arrive for the afternoon ceremony. Sam Morrison and his family, the Kellerman brothers with their wives and children, old Pete Kowalski looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best, and dozens of other faces that had become dear through shared struggle and mutual support. These were the people who had stood with them when standing meant risking everything, and their presence today felt like a benediction on the new life that was beginning. Inside the cabin, Miriam disappeared into the bedroom to prepare, while Ezra changed into the simple black suit that Brother Thomas had helped him select in town. As he struggled with the unfamiliar necktie, his eyes fell on the artifacts that told the story of their journey together. His mother's Bible, now opened daily for the family prayers that had become precious to both of them. The wooden cross, from Miriam's front porch, carefully repaired and mounted above their mantel. The faded photograph of Miriam Fletcher, honored but no longer a source of pain, but it was the newest addition to their collection that drew his attention today. A simple silver ring that he had crafted himself from or found on their own property, using skills learned from the town blacksmith during the long winter evenings. It wasn't elaborate or expensive, but it had been made with his own hands as a symbol of the life they were building together from honest work and shared love. Brother Thomas arrived as the afternoon sun reached its zenith, bringing with him the warm authority that had helped rally the community during their darkest hour. He had become not just their wedding officiant, but a true friend, someone who understood the miracle of redemption that had transformed two broken people into a family. The ceremony itself was simple and beautiful, conducted on the front porch of the cabin where Miriam had first mistaken Ezra for an answer to her prayers. As they exchanged vows they had written themselves, speaking of partnership and faith and the promise to build something lasting together, the entire community bore witness to a love story that had grown from deception into truth, from desperation into hope. "I promise," Ezra said, slipping the handmade ring onto Miriam's finger, "to be worthy of the trust you placed in a stranger at your door, to work beside you in building the life we both dreamed of but never dared to hope for, and to love you not just for who you are, but for who you've helped me become." Miriam's vows were equally heartfelt, speaking of second chances and the courage to love again, of the way shared struggle had revealed the strength they carried within themselves and the power they possessed when they stood together. When Brother Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that rose from the assembled crowd seemed to echo across the entire valley, a sound of pure joy that spoke to the triumph of ordinary people who had refused to let their dreams be stolen by those who possessed power without wisdom. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Ezra and Miriam stood together on their land, surrounded by friends who had become family, looking ahead to a future that promised not easy prosperity, but the deeper satisfaction of work well done and love well shared. The giant cowboy had finally found his home, and the woman who had opened her door to a stranger had discovered that sometimes God's greatest gifts come disguised as the very mistakes we think will destroy us. In the distance, the church bell rang once more, not as a call to battle this time, but as a celebration of all the best things that frontier life could offer to those brave enough to claim them.